Welcome, everybody, to the Competition Archery Media Podcast. I'm your host, PJ Riley. With me again today is cam manager Josh Grind. Josh, thanks for being here.
Can't wait for today's guest, PJ.
Today's guest is going to be great, folks. First, the Competition Archery Media Podcast is brought to you by our fine platinum sponsors. We got Hoyt, Matthews, PSE, Elite Archery, True Ball and Excel, and Black Eagle Arrows. And today's guest, fresh back from the wilds of New Zealand, is Josh Bowmar. Josh, thanks for being here.
Yeah, I appreciate you guys having me on. I've only been home, literally, I think it's been a day and a half or 2 days. And I'm so excited to tell this story of all of New Zealand and how it all went down. It was quite the trip, to say the least.
Well, yeah, Josh, let's just jump right into it because the red stag that you shot was one for the ages, I'm told. Tell us where you were. Let's start out. Where were you, and, when did this adventure start?
Yeah, well, obviously with the coronavirus going around, you guys know this has all, the whole virus side of things has all been really exponentially growing the past, week. When Sarah and I left, it was like 2.5, 3 weeks ago, and it was just kind of getting started, and we're like, oh, we'll go. Everything's going to be fine. All airlines are good. So, a few weeks back, we jump on an airplane, and we literally land on the South Island, and we get to camp, and the Prime Minister says, okay, anyone coming in 30 minutes after we land, I'm not even kidding, anyone landing from here on out in New Zealand has to do a 14-day quarantine.
No
and I was
kidding.
Just like, oh my gosh, we literally barely made it in the country. And of course we're like, oh, phew. Well, they're like, okay, and if you have been, you need to be quarantining, blah, blah, blah. It's like, oh, we're going into the mountains. What's more, isolating than hunting on a mountain? So we started right away. We actually went turkey hunting first, which is really cool. There's a ton of turkeys in New Zealand. And they never get called to because they don't have predators out there. So if any of the locals want to shoot them, they roost on fence posts and weird places. They'll just go out and shoot one. They're kind of like groundhogs here, I guess, to them. When I told them we wanted to spend a whole day turkey hunting, they were like, what? You're here in New Zealand and you want to turkey hunt? It was totally, because to them, they don't eat them, they don't do anything with them. It's hilarious.
Oh, man.
So we got the decoys. I packed decoys, the reaping fans and stuff to get behind them.
Yeah.
I was like, well, heck, let's go try. And in the fall, we go out there with our decoy, and they come running in, and it was so cool. Sarah ended up shooting a big bird, and I was really proud of her for that. And I tried and I shot through some weeds and misjudged the distance and didn't make it happen. But yeah, it was a lot of fun. Those mountain birds were pretty cool.
Huh.
That was kind of the first part of our trip.
I mean, what were they? Easterns, Rios, Merriams? What do they got down there?
Merriams.
It's
super cool because they get super old there, which is actually kind of neat. So you'll see ancient birds, but because there's so much rock, they usually don't get over 1.25 inch spurs.
Yeah.
But if you find them in the flatlands, you can get giant 2-inch long spurred turkeys.
Wow.
But for whatever reason, their beards, ours are they seem groomed. I guess you could say long and beautiful, but out there they're all ratchety and white trashy. If a turkey could be white trashy, this beard was definitely white trashy.
Oh,
I don't know if it's the rocks or what, but it was pretty fun.
So you had a fallow deer hunt there in the middle as well, though, too, correct?
Yeah. So how that went down is pretty cool. So we started stag hunting, and the guy that I was with, his name was TJ Jax, and he runs a outfitting business called Metanoia Ventures. And so I said, listen, dude, I want to hunt free range. I don't want to hunt behind the wire. He's like, you got to help me out here. I was like, you got to be scouting because I don't want to shoot something small. And he's like, dude, I'm on it. And so he was working with these guys, all these local guys, trying to find a big stag. He messaged me. He's like, dude, we found a stag that could be a new world record. He's like, this thing is a freak monster. I said, he lives in some really rough terrain. He said, and it's in a no-fly zone with helicopters, which is probably why he was able to get as big as he was. Because most of the time with those big giant stags, they can't get deep in the brush. So they kind of on the outskirts, and the helicopters fly by, and then people dump them out of the helicopter.
Oh
Because a
man.
lot of people don't know this. Like New Zealand has like no game laws, pretty
Huh.
much. They have a few like few waterfowl stuff, but like stags, you can shoot 100 of them in a year,
Jeez.
and they're
Wow.
trying to eradicate all their wildlife out there because it's not native to the country,
Right.
which is annoying because New Zealand was a volcano basically created by a volcano, and it didn't have any indigenous species on the islands. So they imported them all from other countries, which stags was one of those.
Yeah.
Because we were communicating with all the landowners trying to find backup stags and all this other stuff. And he said, hey, man, he was a merino farmer, which supplies like merino wool.
Yeah.
He's like, dude, I've been seeing these bachelor group of bucks hanging out on this one particular face, and they've been there pretty consistently. I've been seeing them 2 out of the 3 days. He's like, you guys should come and try to shoot one of these while they're still around. And I was like, oh my gosh, well, that'd be great. So we go over there, and I only had 1 day to do this because I needed to get back to the stag. And so we go over there, and sure enough, right away, bam, we spot these fallow. And I was like, oh yes, this is so exciting because I've always wanted to shoot one, And so we put the loop on them, and we get inside. It was I got my first chance at him was about 110 yards, and out there 180 to 100 yards just seemed like you were like in their face, because everything's kind of like when you come over a mountain ridge, you're like, oh my gosh, 100 yards feels like he's like 20 yards. And so I had 110. I was like, oh, I could do this, So I range him. He's 110, and he's like downhill, so he's probably more like 115 to 120. And I adjusted it for everything but the humidity, and I didn't realize because we were it was later in the evening. It was really hot and muggy.
Yeah.
And the wind was right in my face. Everything's perfect. I draw back, and he's at 110, and I poof, cut it loose. And I watch that arrow, and it looks like it's going to smoke him, and it literally goes just under him. And I was like, oh my gosh, I blew it. And so they run around this. There's like this shelf, and so we were up on this mountain shooting down. Then they ran around this shelf. Well, they didn't know what was going on, because most of the time, all these animals are hunted with rifles. Not many people do it with a bow.
Right.
And so, at least on the free range. And so they didn't really spook that bad. They just kind of trotted off. So then we're doing our talking to the cameras and everything else. And I was like, dude, let's just go and see if they went this way, let's see if we can peek over that ridge. And so we made another big loop and came up and over the ridge, and he was standing there at 55 yards. I was like, oh my gosh. I was like, yes. So I get my guys, and like everyone's ready, and I dial my sight to 55, and I go full draw, and he catches my movement. And I was like, oh my gosh. So I didn't quite draw. So I let down as soon as he sees me, because I know I'm not going to have time to shoot. And I grab my sight, and I got my sight right here. And then I was like, okay, is he going to move like 5 yards, 10 yards? Well, then he starts trotting. So I was like, oh, geez. So I grab my rangefinder, and I'm following him, and he stops at 75. So I cranked that sucker. He stopped at 74, but I cranked it to 75 because I now know the humidity is thick. So I crank it to 75 yards, draw back, and then he stops, and poof, I cut it loose and absolutely smoking. Perfect shot. One of the best shots I've ever made on an animal in my life. And top of the heart, double lung. And it was epic. And I had always wanted to shoot a fallow, so I was tickled to death we were able to pull it off. And the communication with the farmer was cool, and just like how the whole hunt unfolded, it was pretty exciting to get him with a bow.
So you got your fallow deer, and now you're back to stags.
Yeah, so that was a good spirit lifter for us, because obviously the mountains were kicking our butts left and right. And it was just Mother Nature was against us. And the problem is, if I was by myself, I probably could have got closer. But when you got someone running the camera, and then, out there, the landowner wouldn't allow us just to go by ourselves. We had to have a guide, so it was kind of a weird situation where we're trying to get 3-4 people close to an animal in bow range, and it's like impossible. And the only time we were able to get close were in mock winds. So when the wind's really harsh, then we can get inside 80 to 100 yards. But you draw back, and your bow's doing this as you're trying to shoot.
Yeah.
That's not ethical to be shooting stuff like that. And I'm like, so it was tough. But we get back to the mountain, And day after day, the quarantine virus or the coronavirus is getting more and more strict. They're starting to shut down more and more stores. And we're like, I mean, should we go home? I'm like, well, if we go home, we're just going to be in isolation. I said, we're in isolation on the mountain. We're fine. Well, day after day, we're getting closer and closer to stag. And at one point, we had him at 10 yards.
10.
And it was the most unbelievable thing. 10. I know. I'm going to tell the story. It's epic. So we spot him on this terrace. He's running, and he's running all these other stags off, right? And they're like little spikers, and he's just a freaking moose up on king of the mountain, you know? And we're just like, oh, my gosh. I said, what if we get in close, we try to roar at him or something? So, well, we're trying to crawl through these ferns and thorns and all this stuff, and we're just making a racket, you know? But he can't see us because he's kind of up on this shelf, and we're kind of down here. So we're inching our way up here, and he's probably about 80 yards off the edge of the shelf. Well, he hears us, and so we're about to peek over the edge, and he comes charging over the hill thinking we're another stag coming to challenge him with his hinds. And he gets to 10 yards and goes, and he starts screaming. And I mean, he's literally 10 yards from us, and all I can see is his antlers. And I'm just like, oh my gosh, I'm like losing my mind right now because I'm just freaking out. There's this world record stag right there at 10 yards roaring in our faces, and all I can see is his head. And so like I'm hidden like this. I just need him to come, and I try to get up above it, and I get up above it, and all I could see was his throat right here. And I was like, I can't throat tap this stag. I'm like, I thought about it. I'll be honest. My inner redneck wanted to release that arrow really, really bad. Oh gosh, I couldn't do it. I mean, what kind of example would I be setting, you know, throat tapping him? I mean, so I was just like, but I mean, imagine having that caliber of a stag after all this time trying to get this thing in bow range, and there he is, and you're confident I can make the shot, but I'm like, what if I'm off just a little bit? What if he turns his head? I was like, so I let down, and then he comes within like 6 yards, and then he realized the jig's up, you know, and he just takes off running. And so it was exciting moments for sure. So then day after day, you know, we're back on this mountain, and we're gaining thousands of feet of elevation. And the problem with our setup was these stags were above us, and we're trying to stalk in below them.
Yeah.
And that's never good because you know all predators that have the high ground have the advantage. So us coming in from below them, they have the advantage on us.
Right.
So then we were like, well, shoot, what if I was like, I'm so desperate at this point. You know, we've invested all this time, energy, and effort. And I'm like, well, what if we just fly a helicopter to the top and then camp up there and hunt down? Well, the quarantine virus that was getting so strict at this point, they wouldn't fly anybody. So there was no one available that would take us. All the stores have shut down, you know, everything's just shut. And I mean, we're like, oh geez, this is getting pretty serious. Well, so we couldn't get above them. We even spent one day, we hiked all the way to the top and then turned and then come down. And then of course on that day, we circle around him and we can't find him anywhere. And then we spot him all the way down at the bottom of the hill. I'm just like, oh my God, literally right where we started. So you guys might have seen on Instagram, that's where we hiked down the waterfall.
Yeah.
This massive waterfall that was flowing down the mountain. And that's where we literally were above them finally. And then and it's honestly, the reason he was probably down there is probably because we spooked him down there and we just didn't know it, you know? But we hiked down that waterfall, and by the time we got to the bottom, you know, it takes forever, you know, to get down there. He was gone, and we can't find him. And I realized really fast why nobody hunts with a bow and arrow out there in the wild. It's practically impossible. Like I was just like, what in the world am I doing out here? And I'm a diehard bow hunter. I would never finish the job with a rifle, but it was half tempting for me because I was just like, the guide had a rifle just in case situation happened. And I was like, hey, can I see that rifle? I just want to know what it feels like, you know? And so we didn't put a shell in it or anything, you know, it was empty chambered. And I got him in the scopes at 500 yards and went click. I was like, okay. At least I know I could have shot him, you know, and it felt cool. It was weird pulling the trigger, but it was just an empty shell, but it felt weird, you know, but it kind of helped get me through like the terrain and the toughness of this. And I didn't mean to sidetrack there, but we're having dinner, and the prime minister comes on the radio and says, we need to save New Zealand lives. If we don't go into extreme strict lockdown, then we could potentially kill tens of thousands of New Zealand lives. And I'm like, oh, geez, this is a joke, whatever.
Yeah.
I didn't take it seriously because, I mean, we're in isolation. We don't really know exactly what's going on.
Right.
And we're like, oh, okay, strict quarantine. We're in the mountains. We're going to be fine. And they said, this includes no hunting, no hiking, no mountaining, nothing.
Oh, wow.
You have to stay in your house. I'm like, why? And then they explain, they're like, well, because if you're a hunter and then you run into a hiker, well, then you could keep this disease or this sickness spreading. So we are isolating everyone. You have 48 hours to get your affairs in order, and wherever you're spending, this was Wednesday at midnight, wherever you are at Wednesday at midnight, you have to stay there for 4 weeks, no exception.
4 weeks.
And the only travel you are allowed, 4 weeks. Oh yeah.
Wow.
Now, how far along is
So
Sarah
we're like,
in
we
her
have 2
pregnancy?
days now. So
Oh yeah.
Sarah's like 6 months.
Okay.
So Sarah's just about 6 months pregnant. And so we're like, we can't stay in New Zealand, so our whole trip was supposed to be another like 8 or 10 days or something like that. So, and I feel like we could have got it done, in another 10 days without being crazy aggressive. So what happened was we got 2 days. So I'm like freaking out now because we've put in so much work for this stag, and it just, we can't get the deal closed or nothing. And we're just like freaking out. This would have been, we tried that next day, didn't get it done. We tried, so last day, we get there. In the morning, we saw the stag bedded way up. It was actually a different one than I shot, but it was still a really big one. And we're like, screw it, I'll just go after this one. And so we hike 2,000 feet of elevation, get up there, and right before we get there, the wind switched and he runs away. And I'm just like, and 2,000 feet doesn't sound like a lot, but when it's like this,
Yeah.
and you're like climbing like this, and you finally get into position and the freaking wind switches and they run a mile, you're just heartbroken. Well, we didn't see the stag that I shot. Like, we never saw him that morning. So that afternoon rolls around, we just stayed on the mountain, ate lunch like we did most days, and then we get back down to where we could see the whole face of the mountain. Mach winds come. I'm talking 35, 45 mile an hour winds. I'm like hurricane winds. Like, we were sitting in the truck and the truck's going like this.
Jeez.
And I'm like, yes, I was excited because I'm like, yes, this is great, because what this tells me is I'm going to be able to get close, in the last day. I was excited about it. Everyone else is like, how are you going to shoot your bow? I said, I don't worry about that right now because we just got to get in bow range. I was like, that's been our biggest challenge, is getting into bow range.
Yeah.
So I was thinking to myself, okay, where would I bet? And I said, well, I'd bet on the side of the mountain that was blocking the wind. So we maneuvered ourselves to see the face of the mountain that was out of the wind, and we found the mother lode of all stags. It was, all of them had kind of moved around to get out of the wind behind on this mountain face. And we spotted the giant with the drop tine, and I was just like, oh, yes. I was like, okay. And so that was the phone scope footage I posted on social media. And we got him spotted, and all of his hinds are below him. And so I was like, okay, this is great, because now I was like, we could come in from above him. Well, then we start looking, and there's no way to get around where we could come in from above him in the time that we had him, because we spotted him at around 6 o'clock. So we only had like 2.5 hours before daylight for dark. So it was a half a day to come up and over to the top. We're talking like 2 to 3 mile circle. So we said, we got to do it. We're running out of daylight. So we literally take off, and we're booking it along this hillside. And we come up over, there was like 3, like, I wouldn't say full mountains, but there were like 3 huge hills. And he was on the 3rd hill. Well, when we came over the 2nd hill, there was hinds on that face that we never saw. And they took off running towards the stag. And I'm just like, oh my gosh, we can't catch a break, And so A runs over. So I'm like, guys, keep up if you can keep up. The only way we're going to do this is if we take off running and see where they go and just hunt them down like wolves, like a wolf pack. And they're like, well, all right. So we took off running, just running. I mean, this mountain is like this, and we're running on it like this, and we're running. And we get to the other face, and I literally am glassing, and I see the hinds. They kind of stopped when they met the other stags. So they didn't keep running. They kind of stopped in that big group. Well, I could tell the stag that I was trying to kill with the drop tine was kind of not injured. He was just really slow and old. So all the stags kind of moved like this, and he was just kind of like behind them, but like 50, 60 yards. I was like, there's nothing between him and me. I was like, we're guys, let's go. So we get to 127, and he hears us, and he's looking our way, right? And I don't know if he heard us, or maybe it was just because the hinds were running or something, but he was standing there looking our way. But I was in a really good spot where he couldn't see me. And so we're just watching him, and it's slowly but surely getting darker and darker, and we're at that like golden hour where we got like 35 minutes left, and I'm just waiting. And the wind had slowed down now to about 15 miles an hour, so it's almost half. But we've already moved the distance in. And so then he turns and goes over this little hill. So I'm like, guys, let's go. And so we take off running, and we run. It was probably 150 yards where he disappeared, and we get to that hill, and we could see a lot, and he's nowhere to be found. I'm like, what in the world is going on? And so I'm looking around, and there's no stags anywhere. I'm like, did these things just disappear? Because we're on this like mountain face, but I could see a lot. And so then like 500 yards away, I could see a hind come up over a hill. And so I'm like, okay, go. And so we take off running again. And we run another 300 or 400 yards, and then we get to another crevice, and then that's when we saw him coming out of the bottom. So when he turned and walked over the hill, when he got over the hill, he took off running and caught up with the hinds. So we're like, oh my gosh. So there he is. He's 150 yards away, and he's following the hinds, and they go up and over a hill. So we take off running again. I said, we got 30 minutes. Let's run them until they stop or we give up. I said, but let's go. So we ran after these stags. Like you guys can think what you want of this style of hunting, whatever, but it was intense. So we kept running, and we chased them for at least a mile, at least. And so they were going up and over hills. We'd come up and over the hills, and we were just running after them, jogging. And they eventually get to this point where there was this like cliff. There was this like steep cliff, and it kind of made this bench like this. So I ran up to this bench, and then they were all on the other side of the bench, and they're looking at us like this. And he was 80 yards away, and he's wore out. And I'm like, oh my gosh, we got this. I said, I can make this shot. We got a steady crosswind. So we're all out of breath, but this is what we trained for 3 months for. I mean, this whole moment was coming down to this right here. It's right at last light. We ran across this entire mountain, over 1.5 miles of mountain, in like under 30 minutes. I mean, which is hard to do when you're like crouching and running. He's 80 yards. I dial my sight to 80, and he steps kind of quartering to me just a little. And I draw back, and I felt the wind hit my cheek. And I've done this hundreds of times. I've practiced this thousands of times. I could tell with the pressure of wind on my face that I was going to need to hold for about a 6-inch drift. And so I held for 6 inches, and I cut it loose, and that sucker hit him right behind the shoulder. I mean, it left and right was perfect, but I don't know what happened. I don't know through running or whatever. But my bow, it hit him about 2 inches high, then middle of the body. So if it's dead center, it hit him about 2 inches high, real tight to the shoulder. And I got decent penetration. I was like, okay, we're under the spine, behind the shoulder, we're golden. And so he takes off. Well, we are miles from the vehicle, right? And this is the last evening before quarantine. So it is now like 8:15, 8:30, and total lockdown quarantine starts at midnight. And that means no one's allowed on the road. Military is involved, police is involved in enforcing this. You get massively fined, potentially jailed if you get caught past midnight on the road. So we're like, we just realized we just ran, miles from the vehicle. And I'm like, we have to get back to the vehicle because we left all of our packs because it was going to be light. So we got to get all of our lights. We got to do all this stuff. So we hustle, go all the way back to the truck. We get the truck. We're actually able to drive it really close to where we were. So he's got a family to get back to. He's just driving it through all this stuff. And we're just like, oh my gosh, we get it within, 100 yards of where I shot him. And so we start tracking, and honestly, the blood's not great, and it's uphill, but I was like, okay, high hit, maybe no exit. I'm like, maybe this is normal. Maybe his cavity's just filling up. But after we got to 100 yards, I got really nervous. I was like, oh, this is not good. I'm like, why isn't he dead? It should have been a high double lung hit. I was like, this is not good. A high lung. By the time we start tracking, it's like 10:15. And we have a half-hour drive if we haul ass to get home.
Man.
And we're talking midnight is the cutoff. And my stag is barely bleeding. And I'm just like, what is going on? I'm like, this is not good. And the guide says, listen, he's like, listen, I got a family to get back to. I can't be jailed. He's like, you can't be jailed. You'll be stuck here. I was like, we can't afford to have any fines. We have to call it quits or find the stag right away. I said, and if we do find him and he's still alive, you need to shoot him with a rifle. And I'm like, I don't do that. You know, I'm like, I'll finish him with a bow. And I thought about it. I'm like, these guys' families in jeopardy. Like, we're all at jeopardy here. I mean, all we had to do was wait till morning and he would have been totally dead. And so we're tracking, and I already made the decision, you know, if we do find him still alive, I said, I got to do the right thing here, the ethical right decision, and finish him with a rifle, which is totally legal in New Zealand on private ground. And we look up, and there he is, and he's like barely moving. He's trying to get up this ravine, and he's literally on the edge of this cliff. So there's like that lip I shot him on kind of wrapped around the mountain like this, and it was just a sheer drop off, and he was kind of on one of those levees. And so we see him, and I'm like, oh my gosh. And I instantly go into bow mode. I'm like, okay, I can shoot him with my bow. And I was like, because he's facing away from us as he's going. I'm like, all right, get your rifle. This is the first time I pulled the trigger on an animal in years. And I shoot him. And he runs around the corner, and we chase up after him. There he is laying there, is stone dead. I get up, and the arrow place looks really good. I was like, I mean, it's not perfect. It wasn't like a bullseye, but it was double lung. And so we pull the arrow out, and come to find out what happened was that blade like this, the blade hit a rib and snapped the blade completely off, and it kicked the arrow in like this and went in and barely got one lung. And I'm just like devastated, you know, but at this moment, because I'm super sad on the inside, but at the same time, I'm like, you know, we've been chasing this stag for 10 days. I'm like, we deserve this stag regardless how we get him. And the world record was 334, and I picked this thing up, and I'm like, this thing is, I mean, massive. You know, he's way bigger than 330s. He's got that big drop tine, and I was just like in awe to finally hold him, you know, and the level of appreciation came over me. I was just so excited about it and just so grateful. But then then the guys are like, listen, you got to take your photos. We got to go. You know, it's like 10:30. We got an hour and a half to take care of this thing. And I'm just like, everyone be quiet. I just want to appreciate this animal for 1 second. And so we're just sitting there, and I tried to, I mean, you can imagine the stress, right? You know, like animal's down. He didn't fall in the cliff. You know, everything is just like, all of it's coming together. And we finally pull it off, like the Hail Mary buzzer beater, like we did it. And I'm just like wanting a second to appreciate it. They got the knives out ready to just freaking carve this thing up, and I would have wanted a full body mount, and they're like, are you kidding me? Get out of here. You're getting the skull. You know, so they I was like, I literally got like 3 photos from the whole thing, and finally got him loaded up, and we were hauling ass. And I say that no disrespect, like language wise, but that was like sketchy driving. And we pull into the house at 11:56. Like, we had 4 minutes to spare before midnight.
Come on.
And we were just sitting there, we're like, oh, we did it, you know, and it's setting in. And it's finally setting in once we got back, and no one got fined, no one got pulled over. And we were just like, wow, we did it, you know, and we pulled it off. And the serenity of the whole experience was just something, it's so hard to describe, because I look back and I look at all the 10 days of pure torture on my legs, and just like cardiovascularly what we had to do to train for that moment, and literally run this stag down like it was like we were a pack of wolves, you know, and I could have made a better shot, you know, but it really sucks when equipment doesn't perform like it's supposed to. And maybe those broadheads aren't rated for an animal that big. I don't know. I never asked them, so I assumed, and maybe I was wrong.
Tell us about the record qualities of this animal, how it compared. Like, you did shoot it with both a bow and a gun, so obviously it can't go in any of the archery records. But tell us about all of that, where it would fit in those different record classes.
Yeah, for sure. So the world record with a free range with a bow is 334 for a stag. And if you guys seen that stag, I mean, he's probably pushing darn near 345 to 350. We haven't officially put a tape on him, but he's a freaking beast. I mean, if
Yeah.
it'd be like judging a whitetail and seeing a 190 versus a 140.
Right.
Like, like, okay, this one's definitely a record of
Right.
some sort. But the rifle record is actually 355.
Okay.
So he's got a chance to get up there with a rifle kill. But I just don't think he's quite 350, looking at him, just because but you never know. That one drop has that drop's probably 25, 26 inches long. And then he's got probably an 18-inch tine coming off of that. And it could help. It's hard to say. But he's for sure bigger than the archery record. I mean, without
Right.
question. I mean, there's not even a close comparison.
I was going to ask you how it feels now. You're back here. You've had a couple days to process it, knowing what you know. Now you know what the coronavirus situation is back here and everything. All factors considered, how is it sitting with you now? Is it getting any easier as time goes by, or is it getting harder?
Well, I was in denial thinking that this virus was as serious as it was, because I would only see like little snippets of it in the news. And then so getting back to the States and realizing like how serious this is, I was like, okay, I did make the right decision. But until I got back, I regretted it massively. I was like, man, he was half dead. I could have got him with the bow. And you know how you replay those scenarios all the time.
For
and
sure.
Absolutely.
I could have, with those guys and everyone's families being involved, and the one guy's got kids and all of that, like it's like, I had to do the right thing. So I know in my heart I made the right decision, but the bow hunter in me is like dead, because for years I was able to say I haven't shot anything with a rifle in 10 years, and that little badge I could wear that I was a diehard bow hunter, and it's all just ego driven, and so that was just irresponsible of me not to shoot him with a rifle. And so my perspective on that changed. I have nothing against rifle hunting, but for me, it's like, it's about getting inside that animal's, the senses and beating him in his best game with sense of smell, eyesight, hearing, everything. You can't do that from 500 yards.
Right.
So you do that when you get inside those senses. And for me, like, that's what it's all about, getting that animal, finding the oldest, most mature animal that's beat every hunter in the world and survived season after season. And then you get in and you beat him with a bow and arrow. I mean, that means so much more to me. And people are like, well, you should just only do it for the meat. I'm like, well, I'm telling you right now, I said, whenever I eat that animal, I have a massive amount of respect for that steak, because I know how much work went into getting that steak or eating that piece of meat. And it wasn't easy. And anything you work hard for, you appreciate more. And so for me, that's the oldest, most mature animal. So like, I could have shot smaller stags, spikes and hinds and whatnot, but that wouldn't have done much for me. And it's like, you appreciate your own steak that you cook versus going to the store or a restaurant and having someone cook it for you, just because even that little bit of effort of you cooking it, you appreciate it just a little bit more.
Yeah.
So I try to explain that to everyone. And I always tell everyone too, is listen, if the oldest, most mature animals had the smallest horns, my trophy room would be full of tiny deer. I was like, because it's the age caliber that matters to me. And so, yeah, it's hard as a diehard bow hunter finishing an animal with a rifle, but with the circumstances, I think it was the right call.
I think the bow hunting community will probably forgive you on that one.
Well, I hope so. It's like, it's a pretty rare situation. It's like, go to jail or finish it with a rifle.
Well, that's the thing too. There's probably no other bow hunter out there who has that entire set of circumstances to compare with.
You have some amazing pictures that you put out there on social media and videos. Where can our listeners see those pictures, follow the video, and follow you and your story?
Yeah, if you're new to the Bowmars, we have Bowmar Bowhunting on Instagram and Bowmar Bowhunting on YouTube. So we post all of our content relatively quickly on YouTube. That'll probably all be up in the next couple of weeks. So you can see stuff right away. And on Instagram, we kind of post that day-to-day battle and always archery related content. I've started diving in more on the education side of things. So if you're new to bow hunting, I got some cool content on there for kind of like the DIY bow hunters trying to learn how to do their own stuff at home. So I've been producing a lot more content like that, but majority of our content's all based around hunts, and everything you'll see is all bow hunting. So we're everything you could think of, we've chased with a bow. What's still on the list, we're still trying, I guess.
Yeah, and there is a ton of content on YouTube. I know my daughter and I have sat and killed hours watching you and Sarah shoot everything when it comes to bow hunting. So check that out if you're stuck at home.
All right, folks, thanks for joining us for another episode of the Competition Archery Media Podcast. And Josh, we certainly appreciate your time and loved the story. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, it was great. Thanks for having me, guys.
All right, folks, that is another episode of the Competition Archery Media Podcast. You can find our podcast wherever you find all your favorite podcasts. Don't forget to go back through the library and listen to some older episodes. Thanks for joining us.